So hello and welcome to the next lecture on Look Back in Anger by John Osborne. So we're continuing with the text. So we already have 2 lectures, I believe, on this particular drama. So this will be the penultimate lecture. So we have one more lecture after this and then we'll finish off with this particular text. So we're looking at Look Back in Anger obviously from the perspective of gender studies. So how is it related to gender? So in what sense is it a very important drama, a piece of theatre on the different complexities of gender and gender performances? In a very political situation. So as I just mentioned, I've given you a backdrop of the play, the cultural context which produced this play, essentially, which is, the post-Second World War, post-imperial England, which is no longer a superpower, is on its way out of the world politics in terms of the global clout that it used to enjoy. So this is an England which is essentially emasculated in a gendered sense. So it's not longer a masculine, manly England in world politics. So it is sort of essentially finding itself to be hysteric, to be emasculated, to be neurotic, and very, very anxious in terms of its location in the current climate. And all it can do is look back either in anger or in nostalgia. So it has a past to look back to. The part of the people in England, a certain section of people, which includes the protagonist, Jimmy Porter, they would look back to the past and be angry about it because they would look at the past as something which has cheated them of purpose. They would hold the past responsible for the failure of the present. Now there are certain other people like Colonel Redfern, about whom I sort of mentioned a little bit in my previous lecture. They would look back to an imperial England with fondness, with a very fond nostalgia. So in this particular lecture what I'll do is I'll look at these 2 types of gaze and look back in anger, the 2 kinds of looking and look back in anger, and a very complex gender politics which sort of characterizes this kind of looking back. So in one sense I'm saying, looking back to a past is also sort of nostalgic. It gives you a fond nostalgia, a glorified memory of what England used to be as an imperial power. And in another sense, looking back also generates envy and bitterness and cynicism in you because you hold the past accountable for the failure of the present. Now we talked about the principal characters in Look Back in Anger. We also talked about some of the characters who don't quite appear on the stage, but they're mentioned and they're very important characters. They're very important third-person presences in Look Back in Anger. These characters include Hugh Tanner, Jimmy's former friend, about whom we'll speak in a minute. He's a very important character, Hugh Tanner. He doesn't appear in the play, but he's mentioned quite extensively, and he plays a very important symbolic function in the play, especially in the map of masculinity that we see in Look Back in Anger. The other characters who don't appear in the play but are spoken of extensively and mentioned extensively include Hugh Tanner's mother, Ma Tanner, who represents the very complex combination of class and gender for Jimmy. So she's a working class, innocent woman. So she's this very passive, naive, gullible, innocent woman who happens to be a purely working class person. So again, as I mentioned, Look Back in Anger is a very important play in terms of gender studies, but also we need to remember that this is a play which keeps mixing up the gender and the class question. So we can't possibly do a gender studies reading of Look Back in Anger without taking into consideration the class question. So Ma Tanner, Hugh Tanner's mother, is a very interesting combination of class and gender. So she's this very working class woman who Jimmy loves. Now, we mentioned, I believe we stopped at the point in the last lecture, we talked about Jimmy's misogyny. So to what extent is this misogyny informed by his childhood trauma of seeing his father die? We've talked about that in some details in the previous lecture. To what extent is this misogyny informed by his absent mother, the mother who was never there? And he listened to a dying father talking to him, and that sort of informed a bit of a childhood trauma for him, which subsequently informed or generated this misogyny in Jimmy Porter. Now, the only mother figure, the only mother person in Look Back in Anger whom Jimmy sort of looks up to very fondly and very affectionately and asexually is Hugh Tanner's mother, Ma Tanner, who represents for Jimmy the pure working class woman. So she is a woman who doesn't threaten him. She's a woman who doesn't have this intimidating aura, the erotic aura, or the intimidating aura, and he doesn't feel anxious or castrated or intimidated or eroticized in the presence of Ma Tanner. So Martana in Look Back in Anger represents this pure working class woman. So obviously this is a very conceptual category we're talking about. There's no such thing as a pure working class woman or a pure woman or a pure working class or anything along those lines. But this is a kind of purity which we're talking about in Jimmy Porter's imagination. So in his phenomenological imagination, he conceives of Martana as this pure working class woman who doesn't threaten him, who doesn't intimidate him, who doesn't eroticize him. So she is this perfect working class woman to Jimmy. Now she's another important character who doesn't appear in the main play, but is spoken of, is talked about extensively in the course of the play. The other characters who don't appear in the play but are talked about quite extensively include Allison's brother Nigel Redfern. We talked about him a little bit in the previous lecture. So Nigel represents this classic case of entitlement and nepotism. So he is just born into a very wealthy family. So he comes from a family with a background of imperialism. So, you know, their father, Nigel's and Allison's father, Colonel Redfern, if you remember, was a soldier in the imperial army. So he used to be stationed in India for the good part of his youth. And Nigel and Allison, they grew up in India entirely. So they used a very different kind of Englishness, the very imperial Englishness which you don't find after they've come back to England, a post-imperial England. Now, Nigel Redfern represents, again, the sense of perverse entitlement and nepotism in British politics post-Second World War. So, you know, he doesn't really have any qualification, doesn't really have any credentials to be an important member of parliament, but just because he's born into a family, is born into wealth, and has been to Sandhurst, which is a military school, you know, in England, a very posh, upper-class military school. So he gets an automatic ticket to parliament in that sense, which is very unfortunate because we have, on the other hand, someone like Jimmy Porter, as we've seen. You know, he's someone who has a university degree. He obviously is intelligent, obviously has a lot of intuitive understanding of the world around him, and he's wonderfully educated as well in terms of his language and his expression and his understanding of the world. But despite all this, and despite a degree from a university, he finds himself running a street stall in an open-air market. Now, this, of course, tells you something about the economic condition of England at that point in time, but also, and equally, it also tells you something about the culture of nepotism, the culture of entitlement that England was suffering from after the Second World War, after imperialism. So Nigel Redfern, another character who doesn't appear in the main play, but is talked about extensively, he represents a certain kind of cultural condition in England at that point in time. Now, among the other characters who don't appear in the play, but are talked about, is Allison's mother, Allison and Nigel's mother, Mrs. Redfern. Now, we talked about in the previous lecture how the anger in Look Back in Anger is very, very gendered. So it's a very manly kind of an anger which is directed against the female. But there is almost a sense of violence, a degree of violence done to the female in Look Back in Anger. So Allison, you know, she's obviously the recipient of Jimmy's violence. Now the violence is, you know, on one level is rhetorical. So on the surface level it's rhetorical. So we can say that, you know, Jimmy is angry and he's sort of blurting out or vomiting out this anger through words. But after a certain point of time, you get a sense of a visceral anger, a visceral violence. So, you know, the violence which is directed at Allison through words becomes visceral after a certain point of time. And this transition from verbal violence to visceral violence happens in Act 1, the very opening scene of Look Back in Anger, where we have Jimmy in a mad tirade against Allison, and then Cliff gets up and the two of them have a mock wrestling fight. And then at some point in the fight, they topple over and, you know, they crash against, Jimmy crashes against Allison's ironing board, and the very hot iron, you know, burns her hand, etc. So, you know, that's the entire scene there is a very good example of the transition from verbal violence to visceral violence. And obviously, the object of the violence is a woman, unsurprisingly. So it's a very male kind of a violence. And we find that, you know, behind its violence, behind its rage at Jimmy Porter, behind its anger at Jimmy Porter, is a very hysterical, important, ineffectual man. So the hysteria of Jimmy, the ineffectuality of Jimmy, the importance of Jimmy as a person is symptomatic or is reflective in some sense of the hysteria of England, post-imperial England in 1956. So this is an England which is not quote-unquote manly anymore. This is an England which is not really dominant anymore. This is an England which is sort of quite nervous and neurotic you know, about its situatedness in the present. And all it can do is look back to the past with a mixed emotion. So you can look back either in anger or you can look back with a very fond nostalgia which is very romantic. right? So we have, so these are characters, and just spend some time talking about the characters that appear in Look Back in Anger. So Nigel Redfern, Hugh Tanner, Ma Tanner, Hugh Tanner's mother, and Allison and Nigel's mother, Mrs. Redfern. Now there are many other minor characters. I'll not spend more time with them. In this Madeline, who used to be Jimmy's mistress, we just mentioned, we just have one reference to her, a very passive reference, and then she goes away. There's Webster, a friend of Allison that Jimmy seems to be fond of. So these are very minor characters who don't really have a significant, substantial function in the play. But the other characters who have a very significant function in terms of the plot of the play, they include, obviously, Jimmy's parents, his dying father who went to the Spanish Civil War, as we are told, who died, a battle for ideological causes, for, very noble causes. So if you know the history of the Spanish Civil War, it was a war fought against a very brutal fascist regime of Franco. So initially the war started off as a left-wing battle, resistance against fascism. But as the war progressed, what we found was, the left-wing soldiers, the left-wing army was supported subsequently by Stalin's army, by Stalin's fund. And then it ended up being a battle between one fascist and another fascist. So the entire ideological nobility, the ideological purity of the war, it started off with a good cause. That got degenerated into becoming a battle between two fascists. So, the Spanish Civil War may be seen, again, is a very political war, but, the fact that Jimmy Porter's father went to the war and fought in the war and died of the war, essentially, because he came back as a broken man. He came back as someone who was essentially brutalized and broken by the war. So he's someone who doesn't appear in the play, but he's spoken of extensively. So Jimmy talks about his father quite extensively, and also his mother. So this entire episode, which happens to Look Back in Anger, sometime in Act 2, Scene 2, is about childhood trauma. So, Jimmy talks about how he's seen his father die. The fact that, he sort of was 10 years old, and then the father was dying on a deathbed. He's come back from the war, and he's completely broken, and, he's ideologically broken, is, physically broken, is emotionally broken, and then all he has is a 10-year-old boy to listen to him, to his narrative of failure. And that becomes, that sort of informs Jimmy's neurosis, that informs Jimmy's hysteria, that informs Jimmy's misogyny. And this is a very important concept in terms of gender studies in the play. Why is Jimmy Porter so afraid of women? And there's one section in the play where he sort of cries out to Clive, why do we let these women bleed us to death? And if you look at, the very graphic descriptions of women's activities, they're compared to butchers, they're compared to cannibals, they're compared to barbarians, they're compared to Philistines. So again, we mentioned this in the previous lecture, how there's a commonality in terms of misogyny between Jimmy and Hamlet. Because even if we read Hamlet by Shakespeare, we find there's a similar kind of misogyny operating over there, where Hamlet is scared of the woman, he's afraid of the woman in a way. And to cover up the fear, he uses hatred, he uses hate speech, he uses a very violent rhetoric of anger, of repulsion. It's almost as if it's allergic to women. But if it's scratched beneath the rage, the rhetoric of rage, what we find is a very, scared man, is a very fragile man who has been sort of, not let down, but he feels he's been brutalized by women. So, again, the misogyny in Look Back in Anger is sort of neurotic, is quite psychological. But, what happens in the end, what happens in the course of the play is we have Allison who becomes the receiver, the very passive receiver of Jimmy's violence. And as I mentioned, the violence very quickly transforms from a verbal violence to a visceral violence. So you can almost feel it to the veins, and it becomes physical, of course, at some point. So Jimmy's mother, of course, is another character who doesn't appear in the course of the play, but then again, we hear a lot about her, and we are told that Jimmy hates his mother because she was never there for him, and we get to know that when Jimmy's father was dying, his mother was never there, and all that Jimmy's father had was a very scared 10-year-old boy listening to him, a life of failure, a narrative of failure, and Jimmy's mother was really never quite that. And there's another thing that Jimmy tells us: his mother was always there for fashionable minorities, for fashionable causes. But Jimmy's father was not fashionable. He was a white man who went and fought in the Spanish Civil War and then came back broken and brutalized and died a very inglorious death. So there's something fashionable about it. So again, Jimmy's hatred of the woman is premised on this again. So his hatred of the mother spills over into the hatred of a mother figure. And that sort of extends into his hatred of Allison, hatred of Helena, and we find out later about Helena. We'll talk a little bit about Helena as well. So the characters who don't appear in the play but are mentioned and are quite significant theatrically and dramatically in this particular play, Look Back in Anger, include Jimmy's parents, Hugh Tanner. Hugh Tanner is this extreme alpha male who doesn't appear in the play. He happens to be Jimmy's best friend, and he only emerges in a conversation between two women, Allison and Helena, where Allison tells Helena that if you've seen Hugh, then Jimmy is a very mild version of Hugh. So Hugh is a barbarian compared to Jimmy. So he represents a more extreme form of angry young man who leaves England eventually, who goes to China, we are told, to write a novel because he thinks England is dead, that all the imperial army has come back. Dame Allison's mob is back. By Dame Allison's mob, he obviously means Allison's family, who used to be, who were sort of an imperial family stationed in India. They've come back. So Hugh Tanner leaves England because of this. Hugh Tanner leaves, the entirety of English culture and settles in China with the purpose of writing a book. But we never quite know what happened to him. We never quite know what happened to him. Did he actually manage to write a book? Did he actually finish? We're not told. We're not given the information. But we get to know about Hugh Tanner. He's a more extreme version of Jimmy Porter, an angrier man, a more bitter man, a more cynical man than Jimmy. So Hugh Tanner's mother, Jimmy's parents, Nigel Redfern. So these are characters that don't appear directly in the play, but are mentioned. Now, obviously, there's another character in the end of the play. You can't sort of say he's a character, but he's a half character. He or she, a half character. We never quite know, what would have happened if the character had arrived in the play. And we're talking about Jimmy's dead child. So Jimmy and Allison, they have a dead child. So Jimmy, and obviously Allison becomes pregnant with Jimmy's child without Jimmy knowing it in the beginning, and he's told much later by Helena that Allison's having his child, and it turns out that the child dies in the process of giving birth to it. So we never quite know how the death happens. We will get to know when Allison comes back in the end of the play, but the child is dead. So the child is another character who doesn't appear in the play. He's a half character who doesn't appear in the world. He doesn't appear in the play world. So again, but it's mentioned quite extensively at the end of the play. So these are important, sort of not minor characters, but important characters in the sense that they don't appear in the play, but they have a very important symbolic function. And I believe by now you will have guessed why we're spending time with these characters, because each of these characters have a certain function, a certain dramatic function in relation to the plot of the play, in relation to the way the play progresses in due course. Right. So what we'll do today is we just talked about the third person characters in Look Back in Anger, but what we'll do now is look at a particular scene in Look Back in Anger. This is a scene where, this is Act 2, Scene 2, where we have Allison's father who's come to take her back, having heard from Helena. Helena has obviously moved into the Porter household, as you mentioned, and then of course she becomes Jimmy's mistress eventually. But this is a section where the colonel, this is Act 2, Scene 2, this is a section where the colonel comes to pick up his daughter from Jimmy. And this is a very interesting scene because not only is it very emotional and psychological, but also quite profoundly political, because what we get to know in this particular scene is the different sense of betrayal, the different sense of bitterness, the different sense of melancholia that the men have in Look Back in Anger. So it's very interesting because Allison tells her father that you are hurt because everything has changed, and Jimmy is hurt, Jimmy is angry because nothing has changed. Something must have gone wrong somewhere. So again, it's an entire idea of change, the fact that England has changed, culturally, economically, also linguistically to a certain sense. So all these changes, they sort of bring about a collapse of the dominant idea of England. So again, what we have essentially is an idea of, quote-unquote, emasculated England. So looking from a global power perspective, England is no longer, a manly England, a manly nation. So this entire idea of the manly, empire nation is now gone. Imperialism has come to an end. And what we have essentially now is a hysteric nation who doesn't quite know which way to go. But before I move into the scene in some details, just want to spend a little bit of time. This is a bit of a digression, but it's a helpful digression to have. Now, I keep telling you, as I mentioned in this particular lecture, that Jimmy Porter is a very good example of a hysteric young man, right? So he's someone who doesn't seem to know what to do in this situation he finds himself in. He sort of screams from his armchair, and he sort of shouts from his armchair, and that's all he can seem to be able to do. And his entire idea is to sort of bring about change rhetorically. So he's been to university, as we know, but obviously he doesn't have a job. He doesn't really have much of a financial capital, although he has a sort of a useless cultural capital that he doesn't quite know how to put into good use. He sort of runs a sweet stall at the end of the day. Now, this is obviously not a very good idea of masculinity. This is not exactly what we call dominant, glorious masculinity. It's just the reverse of that. It's very inglorious. It's very, very unglamorous. It's deglamorized kind of masculinity. And that's the reason why, that's one of the reasons why we call this play kitchen sink drama. It's about very gritty realism. There's nothing romantic about Look Back in Anger. There's nothing lofty about Look Back in Anger. It's very gritty, very dirty, sort of messed up people, messed up households, messed up interiors. So nothing really is clean and tidy and nice in Look Back in Anger. Okay, so that's the reason why I use the term kitchen sink drama. It's that kind of a gritty, realistic drama. Now, having given you this gritty, dirty, messy picture of Look Back in Anger and the kind of masculinity which emerges out of it, which is what the real situation was, it's interesting to bear in mind that this is also the time which produces Ian Fleming's James Bond, right? And the moment I give you James Bond, we're talking about a glamorized, British intelligence spy who has got license to kill, who never runs out of cash, never runs out of good looks, never runs out of tuxedos. So in other words, he's got endless resources, cultural, he's very posh, he speaks the Queen's English, so he can flirt with any woman with a great amount of charm, but at the same time he can shoot anyone from any distance, jump from any building, never get killed, and never run out of cash. So did it ever occur to you that James Bond never runs out of cash? No matter where he goes, he always seems to be endowed with an enormous amount of financial capital. Now, the reason why I'm talking about James Bond, why I'm mentioning Look Back in Anger, because James Bond as a genre, as a kind of literature was produced at that time, this particular time, 1956, 60s. So it's very much a Cold War phenomenon, James Bond. Now, it's not very hard to see, if you're looking at it from a gender perspective, from a sort of a historical perspective, it's not very hard to see James Bond emerges as a sort of a imperial, post-imperial wish fulfillment fantasy, right? So he is something which England is not at that point of time. So what England really is something like Jimmy Porter. So this is real England, emasculated, messed up, not really oriented towards, or designed for perfection, or designed for greatness. It's just a converse of that. It's on its way out in terms of glory and greatness. But James Bond is a bit of a wish fulfillment fantasy. He's a spy who never gets caught. He does get caught, but he always manages to escape. He never dies. And he's got license to kill. He can travel across the world without thinking about passports or visas. So he, in a way, is an extreme extension of the imperial fantasy of England. And if you look at it from a masculinist perspective, he's typically male fantasy. Because if you look at James Bond films, you find the woman in James Bond films extremely objectified. They are all commodities, disposable commodities, which can be used and then trashed away, almost in a very non-human kind of a way. And so, the same way as Bond uses gadgets, cars, very, very interesting looking, guns, etc. But all these are disposable. And they come very quickly, they're very easily accessible, and they're very easily disposable. So again, this entire idea of James Bond as a wish fulfillment male fantasy of Cold War England is something that we need to be so aware of, because this is the same time which produces Look Back in Anger, this very gritty, realistic kitchen sink drama about an emasculated, hysteric England. Okay, so just giving you the picture, just so you have the political, cultural, psychological climate which produces this play, but at the same time, it produces something like James Bond, which is just the opposite of what Jimmy Porter is. Now, if you come to Act 2, Scene 2 in Look Back in Anger, which is probably the only scene which we'll do in some details. So this is a scene where the Colonel Redfern has come to pick up his daughter from Jimmy's house. Jimmy's gone away, obviously, we get to know the scene before that Jimmy, has heard the news of Ma Tanner's stroke. So Hugh Tanner's mother, who Jimmy looks up to as a mother figure, has suffered a stroke, is probably dying, she does die in the end. So Jimmy goes to her, asks Allison to join him. She does not. She goes to the church with Helena instead. And again, this is very interesting because the church represents the very established architecture, the architectural establishment that Jimmy Porter abhors, or at least wants to abhor. So he wants to move away from establishment. He wants to move away from the established orders of life and society, etc. With his very, very left-wing, iconoclastic, subversive idea of masculinity, and he wants to impose that on his wife. But of course, that doesn't work, especially when Helena comes in as his embodiment of middle-class morality. So you find Helena Charles as a person who is a theatre actress, but at the same time, she embodies this middle-class morality, and she influences Allison to the extent that she leaves Jimmy. Allison leaves Jimmy Potter, but before she leaves them, we get to know in the play, she writes a letter for Jimmy, and of course, as she's leaving Jimmy, her father comes to pick her up. So it's a very conventional kind of an adieu. So she writes a sort of a romantic letter to Jimmy, asking him to give her some time, that that she's forever grateful for whatever he's done for her, but she needs a bit of a break, etc. It's a very conventionally written letter, a breakup letter or a hiatus letter, and then of course the father comes to pick up her daughter in a very conventional kind of a way. So Act 2, Scene 2 is about a colonel coming over to pick up his daughter, and we have a description of the colonel, which we'll spend some time looking at. So this is Act 2, Scene 2, the very opening of Act 2, Scene 2, in Look Back in Anger, where we look at the description of the colonel. So he's a large, handsome man, about 60, 40 years of being a soldier sometimes conceals the essentially gentle, kindly man underneath. Brought up to command respect, he's often slightly withdrawn and uneasy now that he finds himself in a world where his authority has lately become less and less questionable. Okay? So this is interesting. His authority has become less and less questionable, or in other words, more and more questionable. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we say this is a transition play from an imperial England to a post-imperial England. This is a person who is so used to being, giving out commands, so used to being waited upon. He doesn't quite know what's wrong with the world. Why is no one obeying him? Why is no one fawning on him? Why is no one waiting on him? Because the reason is, imperialism has ended. There's no reason why people should wait on them. So, what we have, in other words, is that this is a decline or a death of imperial masculinity. Now, if you remember the George Orwell play, the essay that we did, Shooting an Elephant, which was about imperial masculinity and its performativity, how it should compulsorily have some performances. Shooting an elephant itself becomes a symbolic performance in that particular essay. Now, if you look at it from a masculinity perspective, and by the time you come to Look Back in Anger, and you come to someone like Colonel Redfern, imperialism has ended, so it's the end of imperial masculinity. So his authority is becoming more and more questionable. Now, what that tells us, and the reason why I'm spending some time and correlating it with Orwell essay, is that masculinity, like femininity, like any gender identity, is a construct, right? It's a text. It's a text which is constructed by cultural codes. It's a text which is constructed by political situations, by ideological situations, by economic situations. So obviously, if you go back and remember Shatran Sri Khilari or the chess players, you'll find that the entire idea of Nawabi masculinity was economically determined. And when the economy went away, when the Nawabs went away, when the British came over, that brand of masculinity was on its way out. So, equally, essentially, we have here the imperial masculinity is on its way out because imperialism as an economic system has ended. And with it, the cultural codes related to the system have also gone away. So, this is a classic case in point of how masculinity and femininity and any gender identity is notoriously sensitive to cultural codes. And I keep telling you that, I probably started to bore you by now, but it's absolutely imperative that you understand this, that masculinity, femininity, all kinds of gender identities are notoriously sensitive and determined by cultural codes. Now, the code has changed, right? So the change is obviously from imperialism to post-imperialism. So that's the change in code. So because that code has changed, his entire idea of masculinity, the one he embodies, has also changed, and the reception to that masculinity has also changed. So no one will take, Colonel Redfern so seriously anymore because he's not an imperial officer anymore. Okay, so there's a conversation over here where we have the colonel and Allison talking about Jimmy, and the colonel asks the obvious question: so why does, if he hates us so much? And Allison tells him categorically that Jimmy hates everyone in the Redfern family, including the colonel and the colonel's wife and Nigel and of course Allison. Now the colonel asks a very naive but obvious question: if he hates you so much, why did he marry you? Right? And this brings us to the question of class in look back in anger, so about which we spoke a little bit in the previous lecture, if you remember. So Allison's response to that is probably he married me to take revenge on this particular class. Because, again, look at the way how the woman is used as a trophy, as a commodity for vendetta, for class vendetta. So if you want to have a class war between two classes, the easiest way to hurt a class, the easiest way to humiliate a class is to take away its woman, right? So again, we have this entire commodification of the woman, the entire reification of the woman. The woman is an object. She becomes a vessel for violence. She becomes a vessel for vendetta. She becomes a vessel, an object of desire, an object of hatred, an object of revenge, etc. So this is a situation, a very complex gendered situation where the woman becomes the very passive recipient of male desire, fantasy, schema, etc. Okay? So the obvious answer that Allison can give to the colonel at this point of time is that he probably married me to take revenge on our class, this middle class, upper middle class, because he comes from a working class, and then of course the best way he can humiliate our class is to take away a woman from the class. Okay? So again, we find how the gender in this particular play, is sort of extends into acts of violence, acts of appropriation, acts of aspiration, acts of desire. Okay? Now, it talks about that in some details, and then the colonel asks, but the colonel seems to be sort of interested or intrigued by Jimmy because of his exotic otherness, right? And he sort of asks Allison very naively, what does he say about me? What does Jimmy think about me? Does he have anything to say about me? How does he describe me? To which Allison replies that I think he rather likes you. He likes you because he can feel sorry for you. Conscious of what she's saying is going to hurt him. And this is what Jimmy apparently says about Colonel Redfern. Poor old daddy, just one of those sturdy old plants left over from the Edwardian wilderness that can't understand why the sun isn't shining anymore, right? So he's a sturdy old plant, according to Jimmy, from an Edwardian wilderness that doesn't understand why the sun isn't shining anymore. So again, we have an example of decadence. So he used to be this sort of dominant man in imperial England, situated in India. But of course, imperialism has ended, and he finds himself in a situation where he doesn't quite know why the sun isn't shining anymore. Now, the metaphor of the sun is important over here, because if you remember, one of the slogans, one of the very proud, arrogant slogans about imperialism was that the British used to say, the sun never sets in the British Empire, because at some point in the empire, there's always a sun. So the metaphor of the sun over here is important. So Jimmy says, Daddy, or Allison's father, is like an Edwardian wild plant who doesn't quite know why the sun isn't shining anymore. So again, it's a metaphor for emasculation, a metaphor for enervation, exhaustion, right? It's an end of a certain kind of masculinity. It's an end of a certain brand of masculinity, right? And that becomes the beginning of hysteria in England, where everyone's confused. Someone like Colonel Redfern is confused because no one is taking him seriously anymore. He doesn't really seem to have authority anymore. And Jimmy, of course, is confused because he doesn't seem to know what he wants. And this is the colonel speaking, and he sort of admits that Jimmy is right. He says to his daughter that, probably your husband is right. Probably I am. What was it? An old plant left over from the Edwardian wilderness, and can't understand why the sun isn't shining anymore. So, and then he gives you a very emotional description of his experiences as an imperial officer. So he said, I left England in 1914, and except for every 10 years or so, I never really saw England. So my idea of England and Englishness was what I derived from India. But in India, it was very, very different. It was very, very dominant. It was very, very luxuriant. So he was a dominant male in the whole pack in India. So his idea of Englishness is very different. It was a constructed idea of Englishness, right? Imperial Englishness, which is dominant by default. Now he said that, the England I remembered was the one I left in 1914, and I was happy to go on remembering it that way. So that was the image of England that stuck in my mind, the 1914 England. Besides, I had the Maharaja's army to command, and that was my world, and I loved it all. And at that time, it looked like going on forever. When I think of it now, it seems like a dream. If only it could have gone on forever. Those long, cool evenings up the hills, everything purple and golden, your mother and I were so happy then. It seemed as though we had everything we could ever want. I think the last day the sun shone was when a dirty little train steamed out of the crowded, suffocating Indian station, and the battalion band playing for all it was worth. I knew in my heart it was all over then, everything. So the final image of the train leaving the station, where we have the train full of British people, presumably, coming back to England. They'll probably take a ship at some point, but at that point they're taking a train from the station, and that becomes the final image of India, which stays in the colonel's mind. So he says, that was the England I had in mind, the England that was constructed as an imperial fantasy in India. And the real England was very away from me, very far from me, and I had no idea of it until I came back. And when I came back, I couldn't recognize my own country. So again, we have the very complex entanglement of memory and masculinity. So his masculinity was informed by his memory. And when the memory changed, his masculinity also changed. Now, obviously, I'm hoping you're thinking of Cathy Mansfield's Fly at this point, which too has a similar kind of an entanglement. So the boss's masculinity in Mansfield's Fly is dependent on his ability to remember. Then the moment he loses that ability, the moment he loses that memory, the intensity of the memory, his masculinity becomes compromised immediately. Similarly, over here, the entire idea, the entire embodiment of masculinity that is sort of exhibited by this person, Colonel Redfern, is dependent on what he remembers. It's dependent on his memory, right? And the moment that memory loses, and he forgets, and he moves away from the memory, his masculinity too is loosened, and it doesn't quite have the same kind of a privilege or power or authority anymore. In other words, his hegemonic gender identity is now questioned and compromised. There is no hegemonic gender identity left in England, in this particular England. It doesn't really have any hegemony left because England as a country has lost its hegemony. It's no longer a bully in world politics. It's no longer a global player in world politics. It's very much an also-ran, something which is so secondary and even tertiary in the bigger scheme of things. Because I mentioned this was a time which is pretty much the beginning of the Cold War between Russia and America, and England was very much being the second or third fiddle in global politics at this point in time. Now, this is the section where Allison tells a very political thing, which is also quite emotional. After the colonel had described to her what it feels like to be an emasculated man back in England, which he doesn't quite recognize anymore. So this is what she responds with. And this is very, very, poignant, psychological as well as political. And she says, "You're hurt because everything has changed. Jimmy is hurt because everything is the same. And neither of you can face it. Something must have gone wrong somewhere, isn't it? So you are hurt, so you being Colonel Redfern, you're hurt because everything has changed. Jimmy is hurt because everything is the same, and none of you can face it. Something must have gone wrong somewhere," right? So again, what we have here is two different orders of masculinity. So we have the Colonel Redfern, who embodies this imperial order of masculinity, and we have Jimmy Porter, who embodies this bitter, cynical, post-imperial, exhausted order of masculinity. And both of them, they can't face the reality in which they stand. But in a very interesting sense, there seems to be some kind of an empathy between these two people, because the colonel tells quite unequivocally that he sort of can see where Jimmy is coming from. So he says that I can understand why this person is so agonized. I can understand why this person is so bitter. And on the other hand, we get to know from Allison that Jimmy sort of likes the colonel, likes him because he can feel sorry for him. Right? So again, we seem to have some kind of a male empathy between these two people, between these two figures, the Colonel Redfern and Jimmy Porter. And that sort of tells us something about the gender identity and location in this particular play. So, and we'll end this scene, and this is a really complex scene because what we have is, Allison leaving the household with her father. She's sort of going away because Helena had written a letter to her father asking him to come and pick up the daughter. So she's leaving. But strangely enough, Helena doesn't leave immediately. So she says, or she claims to say, that she's got a few more sort of plays coming up. So she needs to stay maybe for an evening or two. But we sort of get a sense that she's probably lying, because in the course of the play, we never see her going for any rehearsal anymore. We never see her going for any performance anymore. So maybe she is sort of setting up the situation where she will start to become Jimmy's mistress. But at this point in the play, we have Allison leaving with her father and Helena staying back. And then, Jimmy comes back, obviously very, very agitated after the funeral of Ma Tanner, and he doesn't find Allison in the house. As a matter of fact, He says, when I was coming into the house, I almost got run over by Allison in the car. And obviously the colonel was driving the car. So he comes back angry, agitated, bitter, very, very bitter, and he takes it out, tries to take it out on Helena. However, something else happens, something very strange and symbolic happens in this point in the play. So he comes back and he starts again this rhetoric of rage. He starts again this very violent anger directed at the woman, but the violence becomes visceral, but then it becomes visceral in a different sense. So very quickly we have a conversion from extreme anger, extreme hatred to extreme lust. So you have a situation where Jimmy shouts at Helena, calls her an evil, mean-minded virgin, and then she slaps him back. And that seems is a very psychological, intense, almost erotic kind of a scene in terms of his hatred. And now we find immediately that Jimmy tries to hit her back, but he cannot, and instead he covers his face and almost caves in. At which point, so Helena pulls him towards her and starts kissing passionately. So again, what we find over here is a very quick transition from extreme hatred to extreme anger. And we have a very complex gender identification and disidentification happening over here. So Helena is very quickly moving away from being this middle-class model woman into becoming a non-middle class, quote-unquote, immoral woman who is very happy to be Jimmy's mistress. And Jimmy very quickly moves away from being this working class hero into this very conforming, loving lover, again, very, very quickly. So I'll just read out this section and then we'll conclude, and then we'll sort of talk a little bit about the psychological impact of the scene in terms of gender studies. So Jimmy comes back, and interestingly, this is the point where he's first informed that he's about to have a child, that Allison's about to have a child. So Helena informs him that, your wife is about to have a child, and, hopes that he sort of softens in hearing it, but he doesn't soften. He actually gets more enraged. And he says, I don't care. So this is Act 2, Scene 2, the end of Act 2, Scene 2, in Look Back in Anger. He actually says, I don't care. I don't care if she's going to have a baby. I don't care if it has two heads. He knows the fingers are itching. Do I disgust you? Well, go on, slap my face. But remember what I told you before, will you? So he had told Helena before that, he doesn't have any public school scruples about hitting women. So if a woman hits him, he will hit her back. That's what he had told Helena a little earlier in the play, that, if you hit me, if you slap me, don't for a moment think that I'm a gentleman, that I have public school manners about not hitting women. I don't have any etiquette at all. So if you hit me, I'll hit you back. That's what he had, confessed. That's what dared Helena at some point earlier in this particular play. Now, and then he says, for 11 hours, I have been watching someone I love very much going through the sordid process of dying. She was alone, and I was only one with her. And when I have to walk behind the coffin on Thursday, I'll be on my own again, because that bitch won't even send her a bunch of flowers. I know. She made a great mistake of all kinds. She thought just because Hugh's mother was a deprived and ignorant old woman who said all the wrong things and all the wrong places, she couldn't be taken seriously. And you think I should be overcome with awe because a cruel, stupid girl is going to have a baby. Anguish in his voice. I can't believe it, I can't. Grabbing her shoulder. Well, the performance is over. Now leave me alone and get out, you evil-minded little virgin. Now the word performance is very, very interesting over here, because we talk about how people are playing different roles in Look Back in Anger. So obviously it's performance in one literal level, as everyone's acting in Look Back in Anger. But also within the drama, we have people who act in different roles. So, don't forget that Helena is a professional actress. So she is performing a certain kind of role. At this point in time, she's still being this middle-class model woman, who Jimmy abhors. And he actually tells her that, you are an evil-minded little virgin, which is obviously a terrible thing to say, especially, but it's targeted very, very violently against middle-class morality, against middle-class female morality, okay? And then he tells her, the performance is over, so now get out. And the reaction is very, very physical. It's almost like you're reading a D.H. Lawrence short story. It's so psychological and becomes eroticized very, very quickly. She slaps his face savagely. She slaps his face savagely. An expression of horror and disbelief floods his face, but it drains away, and all that is left is pain. His hand goes up to his head, and a muffled cry of despair escapes him. Helena tears his hand away and kisses him passionately, drawing him down beside her. curtain. So again, this is the sort of end of the scene and the curtains fall. But what we find away is a very quick transition from hatred to lust. From a middle class moral woman to an immoral woman who is very, very happy to kiss and enter into a sexual erotic relationship with a married man. So again, the entire transition is very quick. The entire transition is very, very volatile and it's very performative. And that's the reason why the word performance comes away up so very quickly. And it's a very loaded word over here. Now, but the other thing I wanted to remind you is, if you remember, Jimmy had told Helena that if you hit me, I'll hit you back because I haven't been to a public school. I haven't been corrupted by culture. So if a woman hits me, I have no scruples about hitting her back. So I will hit you back because I don't have any quote-unquote etiquette. However, you find when he actually gets hit by Helena, when he's slapped by Helena, he actually cannot hit her back. And what does it tell us? That tells us that Jimmy Porter too has been corrupted by culture, has been corrupted by education. And this is interesting because, education over here we talked about the gendered idea of knowledge, the very gendered quality of knowledge in Heart of Darkness. So the knowledge of truth in Heart of Darkness is very, very gendered. Only the men have it. The men who go out there and impale, center, they have it. And when they come back to the sort of European inside, the interiors of Europe, they sort of lie to the woman because the woman must be lied to, the woman must be misinformed in order for imperialism to continue in the guise of a Christian enterprise. Now, so knowledge in Heart of Darkness is very, very gendered. But over here, what we have is culture. So culture in Look Back in Anger is very, very gendered as well. So Jimmy Porter is trying his best to come across as an uncultured savage. Right? This is what he wants to be because that's a very manly thing to be in Look Back in Anger. However, when he actually gets slapped by a woman after having screamed at her some very, very dirty expletives, he cannot actually hit her back. He cannot actually slap her back. And that tells us that he is essentially being, quote-unquote, sort of emasculated by culture. So his entire boasting about being this manly person who hit back a woman, if a woman hits him, it all goes sort of down the drain because we realize all spectacularly that Jimmy Porter is someone who actually cannot hit you back. All he has is a rhetoric of rage. All he has is very violent language, this very visceral, violent language. But when it actually comes to hitting, when it actually comes to taking the physical action, he will cave in, he will cower down. And if you look at the expression over here, that is quite spectacularly evident. And the description over here is an expression of horror and disbelief floods his face, but it drains away, and all that is left is pain. His hand goes up in his head, and a muffled cry of despair escapes him. A muffled cry of despair, and that's not very manly. That's almost like, so he's sort of infantilized, he's emasculated, he's sort of feminized in a way, in very stereotypical sexist terms, of course. But this entire idea, this entire boasting of being this manly man who will hit you back if someone hits him, that is completely deconstructed in this particular scene. So instead what we have is an exposure of Jimmy's fragility as a person. So he's a very fragile person. He's someone beneath all the surface of this rhetoric of rage, all this sort of very, very angry language of violence and vitriolic anger. He's actually a very scared person. He's actually a very scared man, and he's very quickly going to cave in and cower down and collapse and break whenever someone attacks him. Now this concludes the scene. Now what we have in a nutshell, and the reason why we have chosen the scene and have sort of studied it in some details, is it brings in a very important character, Colonel Redfern, who used to be an imperial officer in India, who used to be a figure of manly authority, who used to enjoy the privilege of a certain gender identity. Again, look at the way this gender identity is related to other issues such as race. So he was a white colonel in a non-white space, an imperial space. So obviously that gave him a lot of privilege, a lot of entitlement as a person. So his entire sense of entitlement and privilege was dependent on a mixture of race and gender, right? Now, the fact is, imperialism has ended, and we get to know that England is no longer a superpower. He's come back to England, and he can't quite recognize England around him. And he confesses quite clearly that England he had in his mind was England in India. That was England he had in his mind, which is a constructed fantasy of imperial England. So there he was leading the Maharaja's army. The Maharaja was some kind of so presumably he was in a princely state, and he was a leader of an army. So So he was very used to some kind of a lifestyle of luxury, entitlement, privileges, and that is all gone. That's all ended with the end of imperialism. Let's come back, and the last train in this particular scene is a very symbolic train. And you should pay some attention when you read this particular scene in great details. The last train leaving the station was a train full of the Anglo-Indians and the Europeans who were stationed in that particular town and were now on the way out. And the battalion band was playing For All Of His Words, and then the colonel knew at that point in time it was all over. He knew in his heart of hearts everything was over. The sun had set. So the entire climate over there, the entire culture is a culture of decadence, something coming to an end. And that's very, very important, because what happens immediately, and the immediate replication is the gender identity and privilege, the superiority, the supposed superiority of his gender identity is now demolished. He's come back to England and now he's a nobody. So no one really takes him unquestioningly. So he says, and the description over here is quite clear when it mentions that his authority is more and more questioned now. So people are questioning his authority. And now we have Jimmy Porter, obviously, who's a bitter, cynical, post-imperial man, just the obverse of James Bond. And do keep the James Bond analogy in mind, because it will help us to understand what Jimmy Porter really is. He's the opposite, he's the mirror opposite of James Bond. The very de-glamorized, claustrophobic, bitter, cynical Englishman in a Cold War situation. And also look at the way, if you look at the space and look back in anger, and we'll spend some time on space in our next lecture, the entire space is a very domestic, claustrophobic space. There is no exotic outside. All the action happens inside a drawing room and look back in anger, right? So Jimmy Porter, with all his manliness, with all his prowess, with all his rhetorical rage, never leaves the room except when he goes to a funeral for a woman and a mother figure, and he comes back from there. But apart from that, he doesn't leave the room, and the entire action takes place inside a domestic setting. So again, this is not really a quote-unquote manly setting. This is not really a war trench. This is not really a battleground or an imperial landscape, but a very domesticated, dodgy, messed up, dirty, gritty, domestic interior. And the entire action takes place there. So the space in Look Back in Anger is also very gendered. And we talked about how hysteria is re-gendered in Look Back in Anger. So from being, in a very sexist understanding of hysteria, was it was female malady, but now we have a male hysteric. And likewise, the sense of space too changes. So the very sexist understanding of domestic space, which is female, is now inhabited by the man. The man never leaves the house and Look Back in Anger, except when he goes in a sweet stall to run a sweet stall in the market, or when he goes on a funeral to pay his last respect for his mother figure. The space, emotions, affect, they're all very deeply gendered in Look Back in Anger. And the reason behind this is a wider political narrative of change, of end of imperialism, Britain collapsing as a superpower, and then the rise of USA and the USSR in global politics, and what that does to the mettle of Britain as a manly nation. So all that come together. So we can see how gender is a very complex and loaded term. It's not something which happens in isolation. So factors like economy, factors like race, factors like ideology, factors like employment, all these things come into being deeply in an understanding of gender. Okay, so that concludes this scene, and I hope you have a sort of fair picture of what happens to Look Back in Anger in terms of the dialogue between the inside and the outside, between the domestic interiors, the psychology of the play, and the bigger, wider, broader cultural and political narrative which permeates the play. So this concludes the lecture today, and I hope to see you in the final lecture and Look Back in Anger next week. Thank you for your attention.